Hello and welcome to the second in a series of presentations celebrating the 200-year history of St Austin's Church, Wakefield. We'll be running a series of presentations celebrating the history of the church in the lead up to the 200th anniversary in 2028. And this presentation will look at some of the Jesuit priests who looked after St Austin's in the early years after its opening. In fact, we're going to focus on the first three rectors, Father John George Morris, Father Francis Jarrett, SJ, and Father John Barron, SJ. We'll look at what we know about their backgrounds before they came to St Austin's, and also some of their achievements in the early days of the parish. So, Father John George Morris, and you'll notice there's no SJ after his name because although he worked for the Jesuits, he was never a member of the society. This is not a picture of the man. We don't have a photograph or image, so think of this as just an artist's impression or a holding image so that we've got something to sort of bear in our minds. Morris was born in Norwich on the 28th of May 1782 and baptised into the Church of England at Norwich Cathedral because his parents were Protestant. However, at some point in his early history, he converted to the Catholic faith, and the Suffolk diocese paid for him to attend college at Stonyhurst, where he completed his studies with merit and was eventually ordained. After converting to Catholicism, Morris was sent to Stonyhurst, the Jesuit college in Lancashire, for studies. The Jesuit order had been officially suppressed by Pope Clement in 1773. In the years before this, the Jesuits had become involved in political affairs in many countries and had developed enemies who felt they had too much power and influence. As a result, when John George Morris was ready to be ordained in 1806, he was not ordained by the Jesuits at Stonyhurst, but instead by the Vicar Apostolic of the Northern District, Bishop William Gibson, in Durham. Despite not being a member of the Jesuit order, Morris still considered himself strongly connected and served in Jesuit parishes throughout his ministry. Shortly after his ordination, Father Morris moved to St Wilfrid's in Preston. St Wilfrid's was one of the larger and well-established Jesuit parishes in the country, with 3 or 4 priests in residence throughout the history. Father Nicholas Sewell, who served as Jesuit provincial when St Austin's was being built, had been based at Preston for a time, and it was he, in 1777, who had first requested Father Joseph Dunn to move from Alnwick in Northumberland to assist him in Preston. This is a bust of Father Joseph Dunn, who became well known in Preston for his work. He was referred to as Daddy Dunn due to his age and experience. Father Dunn would spend the rest of his life in Preston until his death in 1827, and as such he was effectively Father Morris's boss for the 18 years he served there between 1808 and 1826. Looking back again in history, when the Jesuits were suppressed in 1773, their property and local assets were looked after by the local former Jesuit priests. Later, following the restoration of the Jesuit order in 1814, the Jesuit provincials started to slowly get back the dispersed property and assets into Jesuit hands. But this was not helped by the fact that some former Jesuits, Joseph Dunn among them, chose not to rejoin the order and instead preferred to retain the property and finances under their own local control. Nicholas Sewell, his former colleague, was one of those who did rejoin the order and eventually became Jesuit provincial in 1819. He struggled with local former Jesuits like Dunn, who sometimes did not appear to accept his authority. He tried to get them on side and working together, and seemed to have had particular problems with the forceful Daddy Dunn, who had had much success in growing the church in Preston without the Jesuits and didn't necessarily see the point of view of the Jesuit authorities. Father Morris seems to have got into the middle of these disagreements, along with his former Stonyhurst student friend, Father Francis Trapps, who was also based in Preston by the 1820s. It didn't help that his brother, Father Michael Trapps of Pontefract, all of whom were descended from the gentry Trapps family at Nid Hall, also had it in for the bishop, and both would engage in written arguments with him at every opportunity. We read Father Sewell's frustration in his letters, for example in 1825. I am sorry to say there is nothing but disagreement amongst our brethren at Preston. Dunn is become unbearable, and Trapps disagreeable to all of them. Mr. Bird has no comfort, and as Mr. Morris is sorely hurt with his degradation, Mr. Bird wishes to give up all duties except keeping the accounts to Morris. All of this is beyond what I can express. They all wish Trapps away, and I really do not know what to do. So if we think about the Jesuits being strongly into education and teachers, what do they do when they have lots of naughty boys sat at the back of the classroom? Well, they split them up. And that's exactly what happens here. In April 1826, we read, Mr. Brooks and Mr. Trapps of Preston are gone to Wakefield, Pontefract and Huddersfield to look after our affairs. And obviously we know that Father Morris soon followed them to Wakefield, not long after in 1827. So for those of you that have already viewed the first of these series of presentations, you may remember that according to the writings of Tommy Timon, the school caretaker and parish historian from the early 20th century, Father Morris stayed in a house on Little Westgate when he originally arrived in Wakefield. Well, it must have been a reasonable accommodation, because on the first day that he moved into his new presbytery, Father Morris wrote to his superiors, "This is the first day I have spent in my new domicilo. I slept here last night for the first time. I have been in Wakefield a little more than a calendar month, during which I occupied respectable lodgings. I have been superintending the works which were very far from complete." In the same letter, he tells us he has 60 to 70 Catholics in his new parish and has been saying Mass for them at Walton Hall pending the opening of the new church. We can imagine Father Morris was on good terms with Charles Waterton, particularly if he was saying Mass for the Catholics of Wakefield in his hall. However, he senses family tensions between Waterton himself and his two sisters and their families, the Carrs and the Steeles. On this slide, you can see the relevant section of Waterton's family tree to illustrate who we are talking about. Charles Waterton himself would soon marry Anne Edmonston. His sister Helen married Robert Carr, a Wakefield solicitor, while his sister Isabella married John Steele. The three families had been to St Austin's separately prior to the opening to see which benches they may wish to rent. In addition to donating to the church building itself, the rich families of the parish would pay to rent benches, a means of raising income for the church. In this case, the three families appear to have wanted to find it a place as far away from each other as possible. We read in Father Morris's letters, "I begged Mr. Steele to make choices of any seat in the chapel. The Carrs and Watertons wished to make this selection before they determined where they, i.e. the Carrs and the Squire, would fix upon, or whether indeed they would take any seat at all. Mr. Steele chose the front bench directly opposite the altar. Mr. and Mrs. Carr came to see the progress made in the chapel, and I induced them to take a look in the gallery then in the making. Mrs. Steele had been very delicate of late, but yesterday she came attended by 2 ladies. Seeing the seats in the gallery, and hearing that Mr. Robert Carr, their brother, intended to occupy one, she declined. Because John George Morris was not a member of the Jesuit order, it was necessary to make special arrangements for his upkeep when he was appointed to Wakefield. The new Jesuit provincial, Reverend Charles Brooke, agreed that Morris would have a salary of £100 per annum, plus bench rents, and any jura stola, meaning mass offerings, wedding fees, etc. We know from a subsequent letter of 1831 that the bench rents amounted to £18 a year, while the jura stola was around 12 to 14 shillings. He was also to have an allowance of £100 for furnishings for the adjacent chaplain's house, on the understanding that anything purchased would remain at St Austin's when he left. As the result of this stipulation, we have an itemised list of furniture and fittings dated 1844, when Father Morris left St Austin's. Judging from this list, mahogany seems to have been a favourite wood of Father Morris. Father Morris included horticulture among his hobbies, and he had been in a horticultural society in Preston. By August 1828, he and a group of like-minded locals had founded the Wakefield Horticultural Society, which held its inaugural meeting in the Wakefield Music Salon on the June 11, 1828. Father Morris was elected chair and gave an address which has been recorded for posterity in the Gardener's Magazine. Some quotes from his speech are provided here. The pleasure taken in such pursuits forms an unexpected relaxation from the toils of business, and every hour thus spent is subtracted from the alehouse and other haunts of idleness and dissipation. So in other words, it's better to do gardening than go to the pub. We also know that Father Morris was blessed with a good singing voice. The newspaper account of his efforts at the church opening in 1828 tells us, "The rich, mellow tones of his voice were very impressive." His skills were also sought elsewhere, and he was called upon to sing the solemn high mass at several major occasions. The reopening of Sheffield's Catholic Church in 1838, the opening of the Catholic Chapel at Selby in 1839, the opening of Mr. Bretherton's Chapel at Rainhill, Liverpool in 1840, and also concelebrating with the Bishop at the reopening of St Anne's Church in Leeds in 1842. He's also recorded as taking a very active part in the singing and dancing at parish celebrations, and finishing the proceedings with a rendition of Rule Britannia, which the Leeds Times reports as being sung in a manner superior to any we have heard before. Father Morris soon earned the esteem of the parishioners of St Austin's, and in December 1841, 14 years after his arrival in Wakefield, he was presented with a beautiful suit of robes consisting of a cassock and gown, velvet cap and slippers. He would leave Wakefield a few years later in 1844. Father Francis Jarrett, S.J., replaced Father Morris in Wakefield in 1844. The picture on this slide is a picture of the man. The correspondence he left behind him suggests he was more than a little annoyed with Father Morris on account of his somewhat poor record keeping. In a response to a request for information from the bishop in 1845, he responds, "The number of communicants last Easter, I can find no list left by Father Morris on the subject. Total number of members of the congregation? I cannot fairly reply, having had no true list put into my hands on arrival. The number of converts from September 1939? Mr. Morris has left no list on the subject. And the following year, when the bishop writes about confirmations, Father Jarrett responds, I understand that your lordship administered the sacrament in Wakefield some short time previous to my arrival here. I must respectfully refer your lordship to your own books for the date, since I find no documents left here by my predecessor stating the same. Record keeping was a weakness that Father Morris had acknowledged himself. He recorded only 10 baptisms in the books for 1829 and makes an entry at the end of the year stating, I fear that by some unaccountable mistake, some entries were made in another book or papers which have now been lost. There are various pieces of evidence relating to the schoolroom under St Austin's Church. In a previous presentation, we mentioned the note and plan which Father Morris made when he moved into the buildings in 1828. The Bishop's visitation report of 1838 shows 45 children attending the school, of whom 20 are boys and 25 are girls. In the same year, they took part in Queen Victoria's coronation procession in Wakefield. In the 1841 census, there's a John Cope, listed as a schoolmaster aged 25, living next to the church, no doubt teaching in the schoolrooms. However, it's Father Jarrett who gives us the first most comprehensive reference when he writes to the bishop in 1848. I have an average attending my school about 60. The accommodation is good, a large boarded room under the chapel. I have a schoolmaster but no schoolmistress. He's a layperson and a married man. The 1851 census names the new schoolmaster as Mr. James Newnham, who by then had taken over from John Cope. In 1849, Father Jarrett was praised in the local press for his care and attention for the poor in Wakefield. St Austin's was built near to the new and affluent St John's area, but also only a stone's throw away down Northgate were the slums of New Street and Nelson Street, said to be the worst in Wakefield for overcrowding, dirt, disease and crime. Many of the Irish immigrants to the town lived in this area, and because they were Catholics, many of St Austin's parishioners. So when typhus and cholera struck, it was these areas which suffered worst and had very high mortality rates. I quote now from the newspaper article of the time. Some time ago, when the typhus fever was bad in the town, there were 2 men in Nelson Street who had it in its worst state. So bad were these 2 men that their friends seemed to have forsaken them, and they appeared to have been left to die. No one dared to go near them. One lay on one side of the bed and the other upon the other side, and they were too weak to get up even to attend to the calls of nature. And the consequence was that the bed and the chamber floor were in the most filthy state, and it was with difficulty that I could get across the floor to the bed. Father Jarrett heard of their condition, and he attended to their wants, and with his own hands did this educated man clean away the excrements, and when no other arm was to their aid, did this worthy priest risk health and even life itself in this good work. The account was recounted by the Poor Law Guardians of Wakefield, whose job it was to keep an eye on the poor. Back in 1845, only a year after he first took over at St Austin's, Father Jarrett had written to the provincial making the case for a second priest in Wakefield and stating, with what comes across as barely hidden resentment, that if the Wakefield mission was granted the £100 per annum that Father Morris had been granted, rather than the £80 which Father Jarrett had been allowed, there would likely be enough to cover the needs of 2 priests. He wrote, "If you want the mission to be worked out fully, I do conceive an additional clergyman necessary, and 2 might be supported here, provided that the mission is allowed by the provincial the same sum which was granted to Mr. Morris, viz., instead of £80, £100 per annum. So, if the province can do for 2 who are members of the society what it did for 1 who was not, the chance appears to me a fair one of establishing a good congregation in this town." Perhaps his approach was a little too forceful for the Jesuit provincial, as it took almost 10 years until 1853 before the first assistant priest was assigned to Wakefield in the form of Father Henry Thompson, S.J. Father Barron, the 3rd rector of St Austin's, has the distinction of being the first northerner to be appointed as parish priest. He was born in Blackburn in 1807 and spent some time as rector at Mount St Mary's College in Spinkhill near Sheffield before he moved to St Austin's. This is a picture of him on the slide. One of Father Barron's first projects was a redecoration and improvement of the church, which was by now 30 years old. Plans were drawn up by architects Andrews and Delaney and included more ornate windows and statue niches along the internal sides of the church. Plaster cast stations of the cross were installed, the same ones we have today, and considerable decoration was added throughout the church. Since the opening of the church in 1828, we know that schooling took place in the rooms beneath. We know some of the schoolmasters, Mr. John Cope in 1841 and Mr. James Newnham in 1851. But as the Catholic population grew, so did the number of school children. And by the 1850s, there were 90 children squashed in the rooms beneath the church. So in 1858, Father Barron invited a group of the Sisters of Charity of St. Paul, led by Mother Helena O'Brien, to Wakefield to help with education. They stayed in a house in Cardigan Terrace behind the church while funds were raised for the new school via a grand 4-day bazaar. The foundation stone for the school on Teal Street was laid in April 1859, and the associated ceremony was marshalled by the Catholic Young Men's Society, which had formed a group in the church the previous year. 6 months later, on the 18th of October 1859, St Austin's School on Teal Street, incorporating St Joseph's Convent for the nuns, was opened. You can find out more about St Austin's School in the 3rd of the series of talks, also available on YouTube. This photograph is believed to have been taken at the opening of the school and may show Father Barron and Mother Helena in the centre foreground by the corner of the building. Although the priests at Wakefield, being Jesuits, were answerable to the Jesuit provincial, there was often some dual accountability to the local bishop. In February 1864, Robert Cornthwaite, the Bishop of Beverley, who in 4 years' time would become the first bishop of the new Leeds diocese, wrote to the Jesuit provincial suggesting that Father Barron and the then assistant priest Father Waterville were the wrong people to be assigned to Wakefield, and suggesting that the provincial should consider replacing them. Neither had the energy which the bishop felt was needed in Wakefield. Father Barron, he said, would be okay as a prison chaplain, but should stick to that. Poor Father Waterville gets worse treatment and is criticised for his eccentricities, with a parting shot that Bishop Cornthwaite would like to see him replaced. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Jesuit provincial wrote back challenging the bishop's views, leading to a further exchange. In fact, Father Barron remained at St Austin's for another 5 years until 1869. But the bishop did get his way with Father Waterville, who was moved from Wakefield and replaced by Father White in 1865. The bishop's letter had mentioned the chaplaincy at the prison, and a salaried prison chaplaincy was made possible by a new prison ministers bill that had just been approved by Parliament. According to one source, Father John Barron was the first Catholic priest in the country to make use of the prison ministers bill to establish a salaried post as prison chaplain of St Austin's at Wakefield. He filled the position himself initially before Father Alfred White was sent to St Austin specifically to undertake the duties of prison chaplain. The salary was negotiated down from £150 to £100 per year, but at the time this was a significant amount and made up about 1/3 of the church's income in Wakefield due to the poverty of much of the congregation. The Catholic population of Wakefield continued to grow, and with a prison chaplain now on site, there were now 3 priests, in addition to the housekeepers, crammed into the small presbytery. In 1867, a plan was hatched to build a new church on Southgate, and architect George Goldie of London drew up grand plans for a new St Austin's. The priests moved into a bigger house, purchased on Southgate near the site of the new church, and fundraising began in earnest. For various reasons, however, the plans came to nothing, and eventually in 1869, when 2 of the 4 Rishworth buildings were to put up for sale on Wentworth Terrace, 2 of these were purchased and turned into the new presbytery, with the priests returning from Southgate to take up residence there again. By now, however, Father Barron had left Wakefield and been replaced by Father Richard Cooper, and his story is one for another day. So thank you for listening, and I hope you found that interesting. That's all for this particular presentation. You can watch the other presentations about the history of St Austin's Church on YouTube, and as more of these sessions are held, there will be copies added to YouTube as well. You may be interested in Dennis McNiff's History of St Austin's Church, Wakefield, 1828 to 1931, and various other books on the history of the parish, which can be found on Amazon or in St Austin's Church repository shop after most Sunday Masses. Thank you again for listening, and we hope you've enjoyed this talk.